3 years ago, a veteran disappeared without a trace, no phone, no note, no body. People said he gave up. But then a city worker found something stuck in a drainage tunnel and everything we thought we knew unraveled. The snow had mostly melted by early March, leaving behind wet sidewalks, brown lawns, and the raw, dull grayness that clung to the Cincinnati suburbs like a wet coat. Daniel Clark zipped up his worn army green jacket as he left the security booth for what would turn out to be his last shift. It was 6:58 a.m. The warehouse behind him was still buzzing with forklifts and half-awake workers as the morning crew rotated in. Dan had worked here 5 years, the overnight shift at the logistics center just off I-75. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. He liked routine. He liked quiet. But lately, even that had started to feel unstable. There had been rumors about cuts, and Dan, being older than most of the others, had noticed his hours gradually shrinking over the past 6 months. That morning, when he returned his ID badge to the front desk as part of routine sign-out, the supervisor, a young man in a zip-up vest who always smelled like chewing gum and ego, stopped him. "Hey, Dan, hang on a sec." Dan turned. His expression was calm but alert, the way soldiers are trained to mask tension. "Yeah? Management's doing another round of restructuring. Don't shoot the messenger." The guy gave a half-smile. "You've been solid, but with your hours dropping anyway, they've decided to let you go. Effective today." Dan blinked once, nodded once. "That's it?" he asked. "We'll mail you the final paycheck. You'll still get your benefits through the end of the month." Dan didn't argue. He just left. He lived alone in a 2-bedroom rental house on Grand Oak Street in a quiet neighborhood of 1-story brick homes with American flags, bird feeders, and cracked driveways. He used to live here with his wife, Cheryl, but they'd split amicably a few years back. Their daughter, Megan, now 24, was teaching middle school across the river in Kentucky. At 9:12 a.m., Megan got a text from him. "Home early. Got laid off. Not the end of the world. Going to take a walk and clear my head. Talk later." She replied a few minutes later with concern, "Do you want to come over tonight? I'll cook something." But he never responded. She assumed he just needed space. Later that afternoon, neighbors saw Dan working in the yard. Nothing unusual, he liked keeping busy. He swept the porch, took out the garbage. At 5:30 p.m., the man next door, Mr. Lewis, waved to him while bringing in groceries. Dan waved back. By all accounts, everything seemed normal. But what no one realized was that by the following morning, Daniel Clark would be gone. When Megan called the next day and didn't get an answer, she assumed he'd slept in. When he didn't respond to texts by noon, she called again. Still nothing. At 4:50 p.m., she drove to his house. His truck was still parked in the driveway. The front door was locked. A coffee mug sat on the porch railing. His phone was on the nightstand inside, visible through the window. No wallet. No keys. Police were called that evening. Officers entered the house. No signs of struggle. No note. No blood. No computer left on. His drawers were mostly undisturbed, although they did find that his veteran ID and an old backpack were missing. His bank account hadn't been used that day. No transactions. Nothing out of the ordinary. A missing persons report was filed within 24 hours. Megan and Cheryl were devastated but confused. He hadn't shown signs of depression, hadn't made any alarming comments, hadn't withdrawn. His sister Lynn, who lived in Dayton, drove down the next morning. She brought sandwiches and a stack of old photographs like they were preparing for a funeral without a body. He wouldn't just leave, Cheryl said over and over. He might go quiet for a day, but not vanish. Unless he wanted to, someone whispered once when Megan wasn't in the room. On the third day, the police canvassed the neighborhood. No cameras on Grand Oak Street had recorded anything overnight. Dan had no doorbell cam. And street cameras weren't pointed toward his house. But down near Lexington Avenue, 4 blocks away, a blurry nighttime image captured a lone man standing near a metro bus stop at 2:16 a.m. The figure wore a coat similar to Dan's. The man boarded an inbound bus toward the city center, and that was the last confirmed potential sighting of Daniel Clark. The timestamp? Less than 24 hours after he'd been laid off. Police pulled transit records, interviewed drivers, even reviewed fare card data, but Dan paid cash. No name, no trace. And in downtown Cincinnati, with its rotating population of tourists, homeless individuals, and third-shift workers, one quiet man in a green coat could disappear forever. By the end of the week, the media ran a few short blurbs. Local veteran missing after sudden disappearance. Photos were shared. Megan pleaded in a shaky voice during a brief local news segment. "Dad, if you're out there, just let us know you're okay." But silence followed. No one knew it then, but Daniel Clark had just stepped off the map and wouldn't be heard from again for over 3 years. The days that followed Daniel Clark's disappearance blurred into a slow, suffocating haze. Megan barely slept. Cheryl stayed on the couch with the local news murmuring in the background. Lynn, Dan's sister, fielded calls from old friends, army buddies, and confused neighbors asking if there had been any updates. There never were. By the end of the first week, the police had finished their initial canvassing. No credit card activity. No bank withdrawals. No purchases. No digital footprint at all. Dan's ID, wallet, and backpack were missing, but everything else remained, as if he'd just stepped out for a long walk and never came back. The only clue was the 2:16 a.m. security camera footage at the metro bus stop. Grainy. Dark. But the man's posture and clothing matched Dan's. He boarded a bus headed downtown. The driver couldn't recall him. Too many faces, too little light, too many years on the job. Megan visited the transit authority personally, begging for help. A woman behind a plexiglass barrier gave her a stack of printed bus logs, but they were nearly useless without knowing exactly where he might have gotten off. Metro buses weren't equipped with interior surveillance at that time. The trail went cold. By week 3, flyers with Dan's photo, a slightly sun-bleached picture of him smiling next to a lake, holding a fishing pole and wearing a Reds cap, were posted across town. Grocery stores, shelters, church bulletin boards, the VA hospital, even public bathrooms. Megan and Lynn taped them up with quiet desperation, always with the same words. Missing, Daniel Clark. U.S. Army veteran. Last seen March 8th. Please call if you've seen him. Cheryl wrote a letter to the editor of the Cincinnati Enquirer begging readers to help. They ran a human interest piece on page B5. A few tips came in. Someone thought they saw him near a Greyhound station. Another claimed he'd seen Dan outside a Dollar Tree store muttering to himself. But nothing ever panned out. Security footage proved inconclusive or unavailable. None of the witnesses were certain. The leads faded like chalk drawings in the rain. Megan began visiting local shelters, hoping someone might recognize his photo. At the second one, a volunteer named Beth stared at the picture longer than most. "I'm not sure," she said. "We get so many faces. But maybe. Could have been a few nights ago. Can you check the intake logs?" Megan asked. Beth did. No Daniel Clark. But there was a Michael with no last name who'd signed in twice that week. He didn't stay long, Beth said. In and out. Quiet. It wasn't enough. No signature. No way to verify. At the VA hospital, Dan hadn't checked in. His name wasn't in the system since a blood pressure appointment 3 months earlier. The clerk behind the counter said, "We can flag his file in case he returns." He never did. The theory shifted from concern to speculation. Had he chosen to vanish? Was he ashamed of losing his job? Ashamed of being a burden? Had he fallen into depression and quietly slipped into the margins like so many veterans before him? Dan had never been diagnosed with PTSD, at least not officially. But Cheryl remembered how he used to wake up in the middle of the night gasping, sweat soaking the sheets. He never talked about what he saw overseas. He never liked fireworks. Never sat with his back to a door in public. He was proud, quiet, and carried his dignity like a heavy rucksack. When Megan mentioned this to the detective assigned to the case, he made a note and nodded slowly. "Sometimes they don't want to be found," he said. Megan didn't respond. She didn't agree. She didn't want to believe that her father had walked away from her, from everything, without a word. 2 months after Dan's disappearance, the police classified the case as inactive missing person. No signs of foul play. No financial activity. No new evidence. It would remain open, but no one was actively working it. Megan cried when she got the letter. Cheryl held her tightly even though they hadn't shared a home or a marriage in years. "It doesn't mean they've given up," Cheryl said gently. "It just means there's nothing left to follow." "Then we follow it ourselves," Megan whispered. "He didn't just vanish. People don't vanish." But deep down, she knew better. Every day her phone didn't ring, every time her inbox stayed empty, every time she passed a man in the street who vaguely resembled her dad and turned to look, it chipped away at her hope. By the 6-month mark, Dan's disappearance had become a local mystery. Neighbors stopped asking. Facebook shares slowed. The photos on telephone poles curled from weather. One was torn in half by the wind. Another was covered in graffiti. Megan replaced them anyway. She printed new ones on her home printer, black and white now to save on ink. She started writing the words by hand. "Still missing. Please help us bring him home." She never stopped. But Dan never came home. Long before he became a missing person, Daniel Clark was just Dan, the guy who fixed his own roof, never forgot Veterans Day, and always showed up 20 minutes early to everything. He was born in 1973 in Dayton, Ohio, the oldest of 3 kids. His father worked maintenance at a high school, his mother cleaned houses. They didn't have much, but Dan was raised on structure, early mornings, folded laundry, hot dinners, and rules that stuck. After graduating from high school in '91, Dan joined the Army. He wasn't driven by patriotism as much as by necessity. College was out of reach, jobs were scarce, and the recruiter promised a steady paycheck and a path out. But once he was in, he found purpose. Discipline suited him. The quiet, the routines, the chain of command. He deployed to Kuwait in the early '90s, then again in Iraq years later. 2 tours. Never seriously wounded, never sent home early. But he came back changed. Cheryl noticed it first. They met at a Christmas party in 2000. Cheryl worked in hospital administration. Her best friend was married to one of Dan's Army buddies. Dan was 27, quiet, polite, and painfully attentive. He didn't flirt. He listened. When they started dating, he brought her flowers from the grocery store, daisies and tulips wrapped in plastic. He called when he said he would. He met her parents wearing a pressed button-down and offered to help her dad repaint the garage. They married in 2002. Megan was born the following spring. But after Dan's second deployment, Cheryl said it was like someone had replaced her husband with a quieter version. He never got angry, but he started sleeping in short, shallow bursts. He avoided crowded places. He couldn't sit through movies with loud soundtracks. He was always scanning, watching, waiting. She once found him standing in the kitchen at 3 a.m. holding a cold cup of coffee, just staring out the window. "You okay?" she'd whispered. "Just thinking," he said. They never spoke about it again. Dan never told Megan much about his service except that it was hot, dusty, and full of sand. He didn't keep medals out on display. He had a few old photos from his unit stored in a shoebox in the garage, wrapped in rubber bands. Every so often, he'd bring out 1 or 2 for Megan to see, usually the ones where soldiers were smiling. Arms slung around each other, laughing in the desert sun. He worked a series of jobs after leaving the Army. Maintenance at an apartment complex, delivery driver, and finally security. He liked security. He said it made sense. You watch, you wait, you stay alert. It paid enough to keep the bills in order and the fridge stocked. After the divorce, which happened gently, almost like an agreement between tired partners. Dan moved into a small house nearby. He never fought Cheryl for anything. They sold the big house, split the money evenly, and agreed Megan would go wherever she wanted. She stayed mostly with her mom, but she visited Dan every week. Friday pizza nights, long walks. He never missed a birthday, recital, or graduation. Still, Megan noticed the weight on him. He moved a little slower each year, winced when he stood too quickly, rubbed his shoulder when it rained. His knees gave him trouble, but he refused to apply for disability benefits. He didn't like handouts. He hated asking for help. "I'm fine," he'd say. "Some people have it worse." And he meant it. Dan didn't drink. He didn't smoke. He donated to the DAV and always stood still when the national anthem played, even in his own living room. He never raised his voice, never told war stories. But he did start going quieter in the final year. Lynn, his sister, remembered one conversation clearly. It was about 6 weeks before Dan vanished. She'd driven down to Cincinnati to visit, and they'd gone out for breakfast. As they waited for their pancakes, Dan had said, "You ever think about just disappearing?" She laughed, thinking he was joking. But Dan wasn't smiling. He was looking out the window at nothing. "I mean," he added, "not in a bad way. Just getting in a car and driving until you can't go anymore. Start fresh somewhere. Somewhere no one knows your name." Lynn blinked. "You okay, Danny?" He glanced over and nodded. "Yeah, just talking." He changed the subject after that. One of Dan's old army buddies, a guy named Marcus, called Megan 2 weeks after her father went missing. He'd seen the news, wanted to help. "He ever say anything weird lately?" Megan asked him. Marcus paused. "He called me back in January, asked if I knew the name of a shelter out near the bus depot. Said he was checking options. I thought he meant volunteering. Did he ask you to come visit?" "No, just said he was tired, that things were getting harder." Megan held onto that call for months, replay after replay in her mind. She'd never imagined her father might drift. Not him. Not the man who folded every shirt the same way, who checked the locks twice before bed, who sent her text messages with bad dad jokes and updates about his tomato plants. But maybe, just maybe, there had been cracks in the armor, and none of them had seen it. The first anniversary of Dan's disappearance came and went with little fanfare. Megan lit a candle at her apartment window. Cheryl said a quiet prayer. Lynn mailed flyers to a few shelters out of state just in case. There was no vigil, no new evidence, no new witnesses, just silence. By the second year, the police had all but filed it away as an unresolved disappearance. The case was still technically open, but no officer had called in over 10 months. When Megan asked for an update, she got a polite but hollow answer. "We'll let you know if anything comes in." Nothing ever did. Cheryl eventually packed away the box of newspaper clippings and printouts. She'd remarried quietly in the fall of the second year. His name was Rick. He worked in construction, liked baseball, and had no idea how to talk about loss. Megan didn't blame her mother. Life kept going, whether they wanted it to or not. But Megan, she hadn't moved on. She still had Dan's old coat, the one with the worn elbows and the frayed cuffs, hanging at the back of her closet. She couldn't wear it, couldn't throw it away either. Sometimes she'd take it out, just to feel the weight of it in her hands, just to remember what her father smelled like, winter air and soap and black coffee. In quiet moments, she would catch herself watching older men at the bus station or the grocery store. Veterans with white beards and weathered hands, Just in case. Just for 1 second. Just to be sure. One time, she followed a man out of a CVS, convinced it was Dan, from behind. He walked the same way, slow, with a slight lean, and wore the same kind of hat her dad used to keep in the truck. She followed him across the street, heart pounding. He turned around. It wasn't him. Megan apologized. Walked away shaking. She cried the whole drive home. Online, she joined 2 forums for families of missing adults. There were other stories like hers, veterans who slipped through the cracks, mentally ill siblings, spouses who vanished without a trace. Some had happy endings. Most didn't. What comforted her, oddly, was the way strangers spoke about grief, not as something that ended, but as something you learned to live beside. Like a shadow that followed you everywhere, even when the sun was out. "You're not crazy for hoping," one post said. "But it's okay to breathe while you wait." By the middle of the 3rd year, Megan had finally stopped checking the mailbox every morning with anticipation. She still left her father's phone plan active just in case he turned it on. But she didn't tell anyone that. She moved to a new apartment on the east side of town, closer to work. Her boyfriend, Alex, moved in with her around the same time. He was kind, patient, asked about Dan once and then never again unless Megan brought it up. She appreciated that. Lynn kept pushing longer than anyone. She mailed letters to regional VA clinics, left messages with shelters in Indiana, Kentucky, and West Virginia. She even hired a private investigator for a few months, but he found nothing new. Said it looked like a voluntary disappearance. Megan hated that term. Voluntary? Like her father had just woken up one morning and decided to evaporate. But she'd read the statistics. Older men, especially veterans, made up a significant portion of the country's homeless population. Pride, shame, trauma, economic pressure, it didn't take much. A lost job, a few missed payments, a cold night too many. It was easy to become invisible in a country that wasn't always looking. Sometimes she wondered if he was still alive. If he slept in a shelter or under a bridge. If he asked strangers for spare change. If he sat on a bench somewhere, watching the world pass by, trying to remember who he used to be. The hardest part wasn't not knowing if he was dead. The hardest part was imagining him alive and alone somewhere far away. One day, while walking near the bus depot downtown, Megan passed a group of men gathered near a food truck handing out soup. A few of them had the familiar look, weathered faces, military posture, quiet stares. She almost didn't look twice. But then one of them laughed. A short, husky chuckle that sounded just like Dan. She froze. Turned around. It wasn't him. The man noticed her staring and nodded kindly. "You okay, ma'am?" She nodded back. "Yeah. Sorry. You just reminded me of someone." He smiled. "Hope it's a good someone." It was. 3 years after Daniel Clark disappeared, the world kept spinning. Leaves changed, summers came and went, and memories grew quieter. But Megan never stopped checking. Never stopped hoping. She didn't need justice. She didn't even need an apology. She just needed to know. It was the rain that finally did it. Not justice. Not detective work. Not technology or luck. Just a hard March rain, the kind that overflows curbs and backs up storm drains. The kind that makes the city's infrastructure groan after weeks of winter silence. 3 years and 5 days after Daniel Clark vanished, a public works crew was dispatched to clear a clogged drainage tunnel on the southern edge of Cincinnati, a grimy concrete channel that cut beneath a stretch of old industrial warehouses near the train yard. This wasn't the kind of place pedestrians wandered into. Rats, runoff, and discarded syringes were more common than streetlights or cell service. They'd had complaints of water backing up through storm grates along Wilburn Avenue. The drainage tunnels ran from the hill above down through 2 miles of sloped concrete and rusted rebar. Somewhere in the system, something was stuck. A 3-man crew arrived around 8:40 a.m. armed with flashlights, rubber gloves, and a long pole with a hook at the end. One of them, an older guy named Kenny Doyle, was on his 22nd year with the city. He'd seen worse things than flooded tunnels, dead raccoons, stashed weapons, once even a stroller wedged into a sewer gate. But he wasn't expecting this. The blockage wasn't far in. Just inside the main pipe's left branch, half submerged in standing water, tangled in old plastic bags and wet cardboard, Kenny spotted what looked like a black leather wallet. He fished it out with the hook, flicking off sludge and sediment. It was swollen, waterlogged, and stiff with age. He set it aside on the concrete ledge while the others kept working. Later, during their lunch break, curiosity got the better of him. He pried the wallet open with a screwdriver. Inside was a faded, water-damaged bus pass. Yellowish plastic, creased from use. Barely readable, but the name still showed through, worn and smudged. Daniel Clark. Kenny stared at the name for a long time. It wasn't familiar to him, but something about it stuck. He wiped off the laminated surface and found a transit issue date stamped in the bottom corner. July 9, 2020. That was 4 months after Daniel Clark had disappeared. He handed it to his supervisor. The supervisor, not knowing what to do with a piece of plastic ID, sent it to the city's lost property office. It sat there for 2 days before a part-time clerk decided to run the name out of boredom. A basic Google search pulled up an old missing persons bulletin, still online, still unresolved. The clerk printed out the flyer and called the non-emergency line listed on the page. 2 hours later, a detective named Karen Bolton reopened the file. Megan got the call the next morning. She was at work reviewing final essays from her 7th grade English students when her cell buzzed. "Ms. Clark? This is Detective Bolton with the Cincinnati PD. We believe we've recovered something that may be connected to your father." Megan's stomach dropped. "Did you find him?" "Not exactly. A city crew found a wallet in a drainage tunnel yesterday. There was a bus pass inside with your father's name on it." "A bus pass?" Her voice cracked. "You're sure it's his?" "Same name, matching DOB. It was issued 4 months after he went missing. We're looking into transaction records now to confirm whether it was used." Megan pressed the phone tight to her ear. Do you think he's alive?" "I can't say that yet. But the fact that the pass was issued post-disappearance and the fact that it was found in that tunnel is enough to reopen the investigation." That night, Megan couldn't sleep. She pulled out the old shoebox with Dan's keepsakes, the photos, the letters, the crinkled flyer she never took down. She stared at his handwriting on an old birthday card. "Love you always, kiddo." She whispered to the dark room. "Where have you been, Dad?" Meanwhile, Detective Bolton had already requested the bus card transaction logs from Metro Transit. Each time a card was scanned, it left a breadcrumb, the date, route number, and location. 3 entries stood out. All of them occurred in late July, nearly 4 months after Dan's disappearance. All 3 swipes happened in a cluster of neighborhoods near the river, not far from a series of low-income housing blocks and 2 known shelters. He had been there. Alive. Riding the bus. In the summer, Detective Bolton and another officer canvassed shelters near the locations. Most staff had changed in 3 years, but one woman at a temporary housing center on 14th and Maple remembered a man they'd called Michael. She described him: tall, thin, quiet. Limped slightly. Wore an old green coat. He was kind, she said. Kept to himself. Always said thank you. Never asked for more than 1 blanket. "How long was he here?" Bolton asked. "Maybe 2 weeks on and off. Then he just stopped showing up. We assumed he left town. That happens a lot." "Did he ever give you a full name?" "No, but he signed M on the check-in sheet. Always the same bunk, number 6 in the back." She paused, then added, "I remember him leaving a notebook behind. We usually throw those away, but I think someone kept it. There were drawings inside and writing. Poems or something." Bolton left the shelter with the notebook in an evidence bag. On the inside front cover, written in small block letters, were the words, "If found, don't feel sorry. I just wanted quiet. M." But what mattered more, scrawled in the back in a handwriting that Megan would later confirm as her father's, was this: If Megan or Lynn ever find this, tell them I'm sorry. I didn't know how to be okay anymore. But I never stopped loving you. Not for 1 second. Detective Karen Bolton sat alone in a cramped records room at the district station, the soft hum of a floor fan the only sound breaking the silence. In front of her were 2 open folders, one labeled Daniel Clark, missing person, the other, more recent, labeled recovered property, Wilburn Drain Tunnel. Between them lay the worn leather wallet, the smudged bus pass, and a photocopy of the shelter notebook. She'd seen plenty of cold cases, but something about this one kept her longer after hours. It wasn't just that the man had disappeared. It was how quietly, methodically, and without a single thread unraveling until 3 years later. That kind of disappearance was never random. It was chosen. The 3 bus transactions that had pinged in Metro's logs placed Dan, or Michael as he had likely been calling himself, squarely in a neglected strip of the city near the Over-the-Rhine district, a place with aging buildings, second-hand clinics, and rotating shelters that struggled to stay open. She highlighted 3 key addresses. 14th and Maple Shelter, where Michael had stayed. St. Mary's Outreach Kitchen, 3 blocks away. Harrison Bus Stop, the last scanned point on July 29, 2020. From that date on, the card was never used again. Bolton traced the last known movement, the 8:15 p.m. bus from Harrison headed south toward the industrial edge of the city, where the drainage tunnel sat. She stood up slowly, the map of bus routes still spread on the table. If Dan had boarded that bus, had he gotten off near the tunnel? Or had he been headed somewhere else? She needed more than transit logs. She needed faces. She visited the outreach kitchen next. The staff had turned over almost completely, but the lead volunteer, a retired nurse named Angela, remembered a few regulars from that summer. Yes, she said, frowning thoughtfully at the copy of Dan's missing persons photo. He was quiet, kept his eyes low, limped when he walked, ate with his left hand. He gave a name? Just said Michael. I don't think he talked to many people. Did anything about him stand out? Angela paused. One day, a few of the younger guys started mocking him. Nothing too loud, just making fun of how he sat by himself. One of them grabbed his plate. Michael didn't shout, didn't react. But he looked at the boy, really looked, and said, "You have no idea what quiet costs." Then he walked out. I never saw him again. Detective Bolton returned to the shelter on 14th and Maple the next day. She asked to look at the bunk logs again. Some were handwritten, others barely legible. But there it was, in consistent block letters. M. July 15th. M. July 17th. M. July 21st. M. July 24th. M. July 27th. Each time, the entry had a small note, Bunk 6, arrived after 9 p.m. On the final entry, someone had written, left early, didn't speak. He had vanished again. Only this time, she suspected, not by choice. Bolton pulled up security footage from the bus terminal. With the help of the Transit Authority's IT department, she got archived footage from July 29th, the same date of the last card swipe. And there, on camera 4A, timestamped 8:13 p.m., a thin man in a green coat limped onto the platform. She leaned in. The video was in low resolution, but it was him. Dan. Same shape, same posture. He looked older than the last known photo, his beard fuller, eyes downcast. He sat on the bench near the Route 39 terminal and waited. At 8:16 p.m., he boarded the bus. The next camera on the route, outside an industrial corridor about 20 minutes south, showed the same man stepping off near Wilburn Street. That was just 2 blocks from the tunnel. Bolton froze the frame. What was he doing out there? She pulled up incident reports from that area in the days after. No assaults. No found bodies. No suspicious activity logged. Just a stretch of cracked concrete and closed factories. Still, something didn't feel right. She checked shelter intakes for August. Nothing. Hospitals? No unidentified male admissions matching his description. The morgue? No John Doe that summer fitting his age or appearance. He hadn't died officially. He had just stopped appearing. Again. There were still two new pieces of the puzzle, the notebook and the coat. Bolton asked the shelter manager to retrieve anything left behind in Bunk SIX's locker bin from 2020. It was a long shot, 3 years had passed. But the next day she got a call, we found something. Looks like a coat and a small drawstring bag. Still tagged. She drove over immediately. The coat was Dan's. Megan would later confirm it without hesitation. Faded green, frayed cuffs. Same army patch. Same tiny oil stain near the chest pocket. Inside the drawstring bag was a tin box, rusted slightly but sealed. Inside it, 2 dog tags, 1 broken chain, and a folded scrap of paper. The message, written in the same shaky hand as the notebook, read, "Don't bury me in a flag. Just remember me in peace." Detective Bolton didn't cry easily, but she had to sit down after reading it. It wasn't a suicide note. It was a goodbye, the kind written by someone who wasn't sure the world would let him stay. She called Megan the next morning. "I think we found more than just a clue," she said softly. And for the first time in 3 years, Megan didn't feel like she was walking alone in the dark. The morning Megan stepped into the precinct, the rain had returned. Not the dramatic downpour of March that had unearthed the wallet, but a softer, steady drizzle that seemed to hush the entire city. Detective Bolton greeted her with a quiet nod, offering coffee that neither of them touched. "I want to warn you," Bolton began, "what we've pieced together isn't complete. But it's the most we've had since your father went missing." Megan nodded. Her hands trembled slightly in her lap. Bolton laid out everything on the table, the shelter logs, the bus pass records, the photos from security footage, the notebook, and the green coat now sealed in an evidence bag. She moved through it all carefully, with respect, like the fragments of a man's final trail deserved. "We know your father was alive as of late July 2020. He'd been staying in shelters under the name Michael. He was keeping to himself, not causing problems. But based on witness interviews, he was wearing down. His limp had worsened. One staff member remembered him coughing a lot. Possibly pneumonia, possibly worse. Did anyone help him?" Megan asked. "People tried, but shelters were full. COVID had hit months earlier, resources were stretched thin. People slipped through the cracks faster than usual." Bolton reached into the folder and slid over a printed screen cap from the bus terminal camera. Dan sat hunched on the bench, hands clasped between his knees, eyes on the concrete. "I've watched this frame more times than I care to admit," Bolton said. He sat there for 6 minutes. Didn't make a call. Didn't speak to anyone. Then he got on the 39 bus and rode south. She pointed to a second grainy image, Dan stepping off the bus near Wilburn Street. He was dropped 2 blocks from the industrial corridor and the drainage tunnel where the wallet was eventually found. Megan leaned forward. "Do you think he meant to go there?" "I think it was intentional. But I also don't think he went there to die." "What then?" Bolton sighed. "Possibly to hide. Possibly to escape from the shelters, the harassment, the noise. Maybe it was just the only place left." She opened the evidence bag and gently pulled out the notebook, still sealed in plastic. His words suggest he wasn't in crisis. He was tired, done searching for something better. She handed Megan a photocopy of the last note. "Don't bury me in a flag. Just remember me in peace." Megan felt a swell in her throat. That sounds like him. He always said the hardest part of war wasn't what you saw, it was coming home afterward. There was still one unresolved thread. How did the wallet end up in the tunnel? That's what bothered Bolton the most. "I had the drainage crew map out the flow. Based on where it was found, it didn't wash in from far away, it was dropped there. That wallet sat on the ledge just inside the tunnel mouth for a long time before it got stuck in debris." "You think someone left it?" "Yes. Maybe Dan himself. Or maybe someone else found him. Took it. Left it behind." Megan's jaw tightened. "Are you saying he might not have died alone?" Bolton paused. "We don't know if he died at all." "What?" "We found evidence of him. But not him. No body. No remains. No death certificate. It's possible he left the area before something else happened. Or maybe he's still out there. Megan didn't know what to say. Hope was dangerous. She'd learned that the hard way. But it burned in her chest again, alive and trembling. 2 days later, Megan received an envelope from the shelter on 14th and Maple. Inside was a photocopy of one more page from Dan's notebook. It hadn't been noticed before, stuck between 2 others. It was a sketch. Crude, done in pen, but unmistakable. A girl sitting on a porch, legs tucked under her, reading a book. And on the side, written in small print, "She used to wait for me there every Friday night." Megan broke down. It was her, 12 years old, hair in a ponytail, sitting on the front steps of their old house waiting for Dan to show up for pizza night. She hadn't known he remembered that he'd drawn it from memory, that even 3 years into silence he still carried that image with him. That night, she drove to the old neighborhood. The porch was gone now, the house sold, the paint faded, the new owners unaware of its history. But she stood on the sidewalk in the dark and whispered, "I waited." Then she whispered it again. "I'm still waiting." Meanwhile, Detective Bolton followed one last lead. She traced the bus route Dan had taken that July night and checked public surveillance feeds from nearby buildings. One feed from a tire warehouse showed a man limping down a side street around 9:02 p.m. The image was blurry. Could have been anyone. But the way he turned, the way he paused and looked back at the streetlight, it was familiar. The camera lost him after a few frames. That was the last visual evidence of Daniel Clark. No confirmed sightings after that. No confirmed remains. Just fragments. But sometimes that's all you get. And sometimes it's enough to keep searching. Spring came late that year. It was mid-April when Megan got the second call from Detective Bolton, not dramatic, not urgent. Just a quiet, "I think you should come down to the station. We found something else." She didn't ask what. She didn't need to. She just drove. Bolton met her in the same records room as before, a sealed evidence bag already on the table. This one held a small aluminum tag, the kind attached to temporary lockers or storage bins in shelters. Faded on one side, rusted around the screw hole. And stamped on it, still visible despite the age, "Bunk 6M, Clark." "I know it's not much," Bolton said. But this was recovered from a secondary storage unit tied to the shelter, one they were clearing out for remodeling. Inside were tagged items that had never been claimed. Most were junk. But this had his real last name. First initial M. "We think he left it intentionally." Megan held the tag in her palm, cold, simple, metal pressed with memory. A makeshift gravestone. A message. Later that week, Megan visited the site near the drainage tunnel with Bolton and a small team of volunteers who worked with homeless outreach. No press. No headlines. Just a quiet effort to trace the area more thoroughly. And it was there, just past the mouth of the tunnel, beyond a collapsed fence and behind a stack of broken pallets, that they found the duffel bag. Covered in dust. Half buried under a tarp. Inside, a rolled sleeping bag. A cracked flashlight. 2 old notebooks, one with poems, one with sketches. A bundle of letters never mailed. And a copy of Leaves of Grass, spine-worn, pages marked in pen. On the first page of the book, in small neat print, Dan had written, "Some men come home. Others find quiet. DC." The team documented everything. No human remains were found. No clear signs of death. Just a quiet corner of the city, forgotten by most, where a man had chosen, or been forced, to disappear. 3 months later, Megan held a memorial service. Not a funeral, there was no body to bury. But a gathering. At a small veterans park near their old house, she set up a table with Dan's photographs, his army photo, his coat, and the dog tags. Friends came. Cheryl came. Even Lynn, quiet and older now, hugged Megan for the first time in years without words. Megan stood in front of the small crowd and read one of the poems from the notebook, one Dan had written, dated just weeks before his disappearance. "I am not lost. I am weathered, worn down, softened like stone in the river. If I do not come home, know that it is not because I didn't want to. It is because I didn't know how. Her voice broke on the last line, but she finished it anyway. Afterward, she left the dog tags on the edge of the park's memorial wall next to a plaque that read, "For those who served and were never seen again." And in her heart, she knew for the first time in years that he hadn't just vanished. He had left a trail, and she had followed it all the way home.